Dr. Bruce Kirchoff. Bruce is a recently retired, but still extremely active researcher and teacher, a great model of the teacher scholar that our university values so much, and it's the heart of the identity of UNCG. Bruce actually was for many years a professor of biology, specializing in areas of plant evolution, but he's not simply a botanist, because Bruce, in short, is one of these people who is very multidisciplinary, and particularly he is one of the folks who really, as I say, gets it as far as it comes to the integration of communication into being able to communicate across disciplines. Among many things, Bruce is a practicing and highly skilled storyteller. He also is a very productive researcher and is an outstanding teacher who, among his many awards, has won the UNC Board of Governors Teaching Award, which is the highest teaching award in the University of North Carolina system. And so that you can enjoy the full benefit of everything that Bruce has to share, and also possibly get some information on how to get your new book, which is suitable for any occasion. And it is Presenting Science Concisely. So see, this is an interdisciplinary communication person. I'm just delighted to present my colleague, Bruce Kirchoff.
Thank you so much, Roy. Thank you so much for the invitation, Aaron, and the organizing committee. I'm just really happy to be here and have a chance to talk to you a little bit about the possibilities I see that for the future for communication centers and working with scientists. I think there are some really great opportunities that are out there that you might not have considered before. And so we'll try to explore those in the next few minutes, and we still leave time for discussion at the end. So when we think about science communication, we often think about science communication taking place between scientists and the public. And there's a general feeling that that isn't going so well. To address this problem, communication professionals will often put together something like this, which, when shown to scientists, scares the bejesus out of them, despite the fact that every part of this cartoon is correct and very useful. It's just a little too complex to approach scientists with this and hope to get them to talk to other scientists effectively. People who are interested in this kind of approach are usually the scientists who are leaving science and want to enter in some kind of scientific communication profession, like as a writer for magazines, etc. For scientists, we need something simpler. We need something that's going to address the problems that they face in their work. If we can find that, then we can begin to address another problem that scientists face, and that is the more immediate problem. It will lead us into the problem of talking to the public, and that is scientists talking to other scientists. Because in fact, scientists are really good at only talking to people in their very small in-group. So let's talk a little bit, just 1 minute, about kind of 3 groups of people that scientists might talk to. The first one that I called that in-group is your research group, the people work in the same area as you do, the people who you've studied with. That's the group that you know best, the group that all knows all the technical details of it. Then there's the group slightly larger than that, and that is other scientists who may not know all the details of your work, but do know a lot about science and know maybe a little bit about your area. And the third big group is the general public. So those are kind of the 3 areas, the 3 publics, 3 communities that scientists have to talk to. So talking to that middle group, other scientists, does not often go very well for scientists. In fact, there are whole organizations like the group that publishes American Scientist, the magazine American Scientist was originally designed and has continued this policy of having articles in it that someone outside of the field of the person who's written the article can understand. So it is really this problem of scientists talking to other scientists, and the magazine is addressed to them. They certainly haven't solved the whole problem, but they are one of the contributing factors that are working on it. Well, what I'm suggesting then is that there's an intermediate stage between the scientists and talking to the public and scientists, and the failure that that usually brings, and that is scientists talking to other scientists. And so to understand how we might make that work, how we might help scientists in a problem that they have, and in that process, help them talk to the public, we should take a look at what it means to be a scientist. What does that training look like? And how do we get to that problem where scientists are only able to talk really well to that small in-group? Well, science training begins for most students when they graduate from undergraduate degree. Now, these students have generally done an undergraduate degree in some kind of science, but their training really begins, their adventure really begins when they come to graduate school. And so they enter graduate school full of enthusiasm, and they find themselves back in classrooms for about half of their time. Those classroom experiences, of course, are at a higher level with smaller classes, more conceptually oriented than they were before, but still, for the first 2 years of their work, they're probably spending half of their time in classrooms. Now, I'm going to talk about this career of a scientist through graduate school as if they were going to finish in 4 years. In fact, very few scientists finish in 4 years, but it gives us a standard by which I can talk about the progress through the program. So for the first 2 years, they're in these, half of their time is about in classes. The other half of their time is teaching, usually teaching laboratories. And this guy over here is the teaching assistant, assisting these undergraduates. About 20 hours a week, half of their time will be spent doing this. Now, the really good news about this is that this will pay for their graduate education. And if they're very frugal, it'll pay for their living expenses too, but very frugal is the key word there. The great news is that a scientist can exit graduate school with no debt or very little debt. But there's a cost. It takes a lot of time to do this. And they're going to be constantly pulled back and forth between the duties of teaching and the duties of the research. Because the other half of their time, and yes, I know we are over full time now, is spent working in the laboratory with their advisor, learning new techniques, sometimes learning really arcane kinds of materials, learning to operate machinery that they're now expected not just to sit in on in a class, but they're supposed to operate it themselves, understand how it works. If they're growing organisms or working with the organisms somehow, they've got to learn those organisms, they've got to learn how to cultivate them. Another whole process of learning that has to take place in them. Now, sometimes this work with their advisee will generate class credit. So it can reduce the amount of work that they have to do a tiny bit because they're getting course credit for it. But still, we're over a full-time job with everything that's expected of a new graduate student coming in. If the graduate student is in a field like ecology, they're also expected to do field work. And in those first year or two, they'll be planning their field work, learning what that involves. Although they're maybe not dealing with electron microscopes, as in the last picture, they may be dealing with, how to get to the field and how to collect data in the field and to operate all of that when all kinds of things go against you, like weather. While they're doing all of this in their first 2 years, they're also supposed to be thinking about their research plan. And their research plan is supposed to be advancing. So part of that work that they're doing with their mentor is to make a research plan, a unique plan that is unique to them and contributes something new to knowledge. This is one of the most important things that they're doing during that time. So that by the second summer of graduate school, they are doing their independent research. No later than the second summer of graduate school, they're doing their independent research. It varies a lot in different laboratories when this will start and things, but no later than that should it start. So they're on their own in the laboratory conducting experiments that they've designed, or they're in the field collecting data on, again, experiments that they've designed on this. This time in the laboratory or in the field is one of the most enjoyable times of a scientist's life. They'll look back at these times often with great fondness because they have essentially no administrative responsibilities. They're working on projects that they are interest to them, and they're often, if they're doing field work, in very beautiful areas. And so it's really an ideal time for what they're very technical kinds of work and what they're doing, but really enjoyable. And just kind of keep that in mind. This is really like, this is their happy place. This is what a scientist's happy place is, in that research lab or research field. Coming back from the field or coming out of the lab, they've got a lot of data. And in the third and fourth year, they've got to be analyzing that data. That analysis can go on up through the fourth year, in fact, right up until the time they submit their thesis. Certainly for me, I was analyzing data within about a week or two before I submitted, right before I submitted the thesis, and really important insights came in that last week or so. So this is a very time-consuming process once they have got some data coming in. You notice we haven't talked anything about scientific communication in any of this process. There has been scientific communication going on, and it looks like this. So this is a lab group sitting around. This is over here is the PI, or the head of the lab, and all the others are graduate students and postdocs. They're sitting around discussing the research of that lab. The research is in technical details. They're reading technical papers, discussing techniques, using all kinds of arcane terminology, criticizing each other's research. It is a very technical and detailed field. And this is what this graduate students then come to learn is scientific communication. It focuses on their work on that smallest of small in-groups, even smaller than just people working in your field. It's for people working in your lab. Sometime around the third year, they're going to give a talk at a scientific meeting, probably on preliminary data or on the techniques that they're going to use. It's not going to be a final talk. They'll do that in their fourth year, end of their fourth year, when they actually have data to talk about. Now they're kind of getting their feet wet. And you've noticed now that nothing in their training has prepared them for this. They're ready to talk to the in-group. They are not ready to talk at a general botanical society meeting or a general neuroscience meeting, et cetera, where they're talking to a broad range of scientists outside their local specialty. Well, it's not surprising then that these talks are a little bit mechanical, at least in content, if not in delivery. Some of them are actually delivered quite well because, remember, these students have been teaching for that previous 2 or 3 years. And they have learned usually something about that, how to present. But they think that science is going to be about presenting all those technical details. And so it tends to be a little bit detailed in what they want to do. To get them to be engaged with their audience, using the techniques that you know will engage an audience and communicate with them well, takes time. It is a process that's going to develop over years of trials and failures. But we can help that out. There are things we could do to make that process easier. We just have to identify what their problems are in making that transition to that first talk, and then design interventions that will help them make that transition more easily. So I'm going to suggest 2 things that a scientist focuses, a young scientist has when they start to make that transition to their first talk in front of a more general audience. And the first thing they have to do when they're getting that talk ready is they have to write a title to their talk. That title is usually not very good the first time. And it's usually not very good because they're using as a model the other talks that they've seen. And the other talks and papers that they've seen have titles like this: Impacts of Stimulus Polarity on OVAP Response Using the Belly Tendon Electrode Montage. Yeah, I don't know what that's about either. Unfortunately, this is true of most talks. Unless you're working in one of those areas, you have no idea what that is. You don't know what their conclusions are going to be. You have no interest in ever looking at that paper again. Vast majority of titles and papers are like this, and titles of talks are like this. And so a graduate student naturally thinks that that's what their title should be like. Second type of title is like this: joke titles. I wish I could tell you I'd never written one of these. Again, if you don't work on anal evolution, you won't know that it's a fascinating subject from this title, and you won't know what these people are going to say about it. But it sure does feel good to the people who wrote this title that they've made this cool in-joke of in-group stuff again there. Now, a title shouldn't be either one of these things. It should be like this one. It's still a technical title. You can tell in this title that it's about birds. You know, the organism that they're working on. You know, it's about flight because it's got wing warping in there. It's got there. And it's got something about birds flying with stable and unstable states. Well, it's starting to get interesting, isn't it? What's that mean? A bird is flying, but it's not stable in its flight. So you might want to look into this paper and find a little bit more. So the paper, this title gives you, as a scientist, something about what the conclusions of this research are about, tells you the organism about it, it tells you some technical deals about it. Even for someone who's a botanist, I look at this and I say that might be kind of an interesting paper to look at. And I read the abstract on it. Well, perhaps not surprising, this paper, which was published in Nature, has only been out for about 2 weeks now, and it's gotten a lot of responses. So part of that, of course, is because it's in Nature. But I think part of it also is because when people are scanning Nature and they look down the titles and they come to one they can understand, they say, that's pretty interesting, and it's about birds too. So that's what we want from a title. A title should state the main finding of the research. It should be like a lens that you're looking through and gives you a magnification view of what the main point of the research is. Now, you notice that's a relatively simple thing to say to students, and they can understand it relatively simply. I'll tell you that it is not going to be simple for them to do that, but they can get the idea, and then I'm sure you know how to design interventions to teach them and help them find the main finding of their research. I can talk to you about some ways that I've done that, if you'd like to, in the question and answer period. The second thing a scientist needs to do is they need to write an abstract for that first talk. This is one of my favorite descriptions of how you should write an abstract. It's from Nature. I don't expect you to read this. What I expect you to see is that it's very detailed. Nature abstracts are some of the best abstracts you can read, and this kind of instruction is why they're doing it. They tell you almost every sentence what you do. You can't get a graduate student to write an abstract like that. We need something simpler. But there are really nice models out there for more advanced scientists if they want to look at doing this. So what can we do, and what can you guys do, know not about science, but know a lot about communications, to help a scientist, a young scientist, write an abstract better? Well, fortunately, there's a very simple way to do this, and it's one you know very well because it goes back to Aristotle, although it's been popularized more recently by the scientist turned filmmaker Randy Olson, who's written a number of books that talk about this model and but therefore. It goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a village where all of the women were smart, the men were beautiful, and the children were above average. But there was a problem. No one was happy. And so they took it upon themselves to take on research to find out why no one was happy and to make a solution. Until finally, one day, they solved the problem. And not only were all the women smart, the men beautiful, and the children above average, but everyone was happy. It's a classic story structure. And, but, and therefore. Let's look at the abstract of that bird article and see that it says the same thing. Again, you don't need to read this. I'll just point out some things. The first part, birds morphing their wing shape, avian-specific equations of motions. These are things that are known before. Birds aerodynamics, all stuff that's known before. It's the setup for the story. But, oh my goodness, people haven't taken certain things into account when they're doing these models. So let's fix that. And that's the research that we did. A very simple structure, and a structure that students can understand and begin to use to write their abstracts. Again, it won't be easy because they will want that therefore statement that'll go up in the top, and it'll just be a big list of I did this and I did this and I did this and I used this technique and that. There's one more part of this, and all good stories have conclusions, and so we could say that there's a conclusion at the very end. And if we were to read that conclusion, we would find out that it mirrors the title. So that's a nice storytelling technique, isn't it? You have the beginning of the story and the end of the story mirrors that beginning of the story. These good abstracts have that also. The title is the first part and the elaboration is in the conclusions. Now, in fact, when I have students working on titles and trying to learn to write good titles, I will give them abstracts like this with a bad title. And I'll say, look at the bottom, look at the last 2 or 3 sentences. That's what they should be having in the title. Write a title that expresses those things. And they can start to do that, and they start to get experience then writing titles in that way. So very easy and very simple, but very effective. So that when a student then comes to give their first talk, they can do a little better job of it. They can organize the talk in a way. And in fact, they can organize the talk just as they've organized their abstract, with those 3 parts and then a nice conclusion at the end that mirrors it. A short talk should have that same structure as a story that we just talked about. So that will help us then get scientists talking to other scientists outside of their little in-group, doing a better job of talking to scientists in general. And if they can talk to other scientists in general, it's not such a big leap to get them to talk and tell stories to the general public. So that the solution to the problem of talking to the general public, I believe, is to help scientists do better talking to scientists. And if every scientist is talking to other scientists better, 98% of what they're talking about is to other scientists, then they've got good practice there to talk to the general public. And everyone is starting to communicate better, and we can start to solve that problem. So instead of hitting a scientist with something this complex, you've got all these tools in your bag. You don't have to pull them all out at once. Take them out one at a time and work with scientists on that in a small step-by-step process, and you can reach them and you can get them to change the way that they're presenting their work. There's a real important role there for communications centers faculty. Well, after having said these things, I want to talk a little bit about some of the resources that might help you along this path if you decide that this is something that your center should be working on. And one of those resources, in fact, the most important one, I think, is not one you've probably considered before, and that is funding through the National Science Foundation. So let's take a look at some grants that have recently been funded through the National Science Foundation. You might be surprised at what these grants are, because I certainly was surprised when I looked at them. First of all, the National Science Foundation is organized in a number of divisions, and those divisions are clumped into directorates. So directorates and divisions. Each of these divisions has got its own goals and its own pot of money. So applying to one division doesn't have to say anything about applying to another division. You could apply to numbers of different divisions. It's all different pots of money. So I'm going to look at grants funded by 4 different divisions. There's quite a few more than 4, but here are 4 of them. So this grant applies an intercultural communication theory. That's to it designs and tests new inclusive science communication curriculum. Over $1 million. It's a multi-year grant. The second one is about improving science curricula in education schools. And so they're developing course modules in science communication to the general public. The first one, division of learning. The second one, division of undergraduate education. Different kinds of goals. This is a planning grant to the Division of Human Research Development. It's a year-long program. It's a shorter program, $100,000 for a year. It develops a professional developed program and tests a professional developed program, apparently that they've developed already. And it's focused on public service, which could be communication, could be other things. Public service can be other kinds of things. Here's the Division of Graduate Education. It's a planning grant, a multi-year grant again. It focuses on diversity and inclusion, but look at the kinds of strategic planning approaches they're using. They're using dialogic approaches. Talking circles, listening circles, convenings are main parts that they've used for these grants. These are all, it seems to me, things that speaking centers could easily participate in. Well, this is some of the four of many grants that NSF has funded. You can find out other types of grants and get ideas for what your center might be doing or your university might be doing by going to the NSF grant search page. Just Google NSF grant search or grant award search, and you'll find this page. And then look for active awards. I typed communication in to find those grants, but you could put words in that you feel like are appropriate to your center and see what they're funding. You might be surprised the kinds of things that they're funding. So this is one type of grant that NSF does. You can see they're kind of curriculum-based grants, planning grants, diversity inclusion grants, things that are cross-cutting across different types of courses, different types of parts of the university. There's usually research components into each of these because they want to know that the interventions that they're developing are working. But there's another type of grant that NSF does that is what scientists get. The scientists mainly get as their primary grant a research grant in their field, and this is what you think of NSF for. So they're getting a grant to work on some aspect of the genetics of the fruit fly, for instance. There's many grants that are given like that. NIH also gives many fruit fly grants. These grants are evaluated by two kinds of criteria. One of them is the one you expect. Is the intellectual merit of the science worthy of funding? But there's another criterion. It's called broader impacts. And to get a grant funded in NSF, you have to have a good broader impacts program in it. Good broader impacts means in terms of money. Let's say you've got a $400,000 grant. It's maybe a multi-year grant, 2 or 3 years. You should be planning to put in at least $100,000 of that to broader impacts. Otherwise, they're not going to take you seriously. They don't think that you're taking broader impacts seriously. Broader impacts are very broadly defined. Communication sits in there, diversity inclusion sits in there, scientific literature sits in there, public policy sits in there. There are things here that you could work on through Communication Center and come into those grants. So you would be, in these type of cases, a partner. Communication Center might be a partner with the individual researchers or departments saying, we are going to help you with this part of the grant. You're the main PI, we're helping you with this part of the grant to do these things. And you start to have conversations with the science departments on your campus if you wanted to look into that, and the grants people. Now, the other great news about this is that you're not alone in doing this. Broader impacts are hard to understand. NSF knows that broader impacts are hard to understand, and still is the community of people who work on this. NSF funded a grant, $5 million multi-year grant to form this group called ARIS, Advancing Research Impact in Society. ARIS's goal is to help you at universities prepare better, broader impact statements. So they are out there for individual consultations. They also have year-long programs that your university can participate in, where they'll come back and forth with you, either virtually or in person, to work with you, develop a broader impacts community on your campus. Because remember, they're collaborative proposals, they're collaborations with science faculty. So ARIS is out there. Now, I want to say two things about ARIS. One is, remember, this is an NSF grant. And NSF grants work like this. They're funded, and then the funding stops. And if they're not renewed, that thing goes away. So ARIS is there now, and they're working, and they're having all these programs open. And if you wait 3 years, they might not be there. They might not be renewed. Maybe they'll be renewed. We don't know. We won't know for some time. They're doing a great job, so we're hoping they're going to be renewed, but you don't know yet. We're in the first round of this grant. Second thing is, they've got calls for, they've got like RFPs open right now. They've got one right now. So ARIS has developed this toolkit, a broader impacts toolkit. And you can use this toolkit even without having a formal relationship with them. But if you are using it on your campus, they have the opportunity to work with them to evaluate how the toolkit is working on your campus. Because remember, I said all these NSF grants have to have evaluation components. So they want to know if this toolkit, which helps campuses develop broader impact statements, is actually helping campuses develop broader impact statements. There's actually funding for this. There's a $25,000 stipend for your campus if you participate in this program, if you're accepted into the program. So that closes, as it says, May 6th. There was another program that's an even bigger program, a year-long program, but the applications have just closed for that. So that's what I wanted to say. I wanted to say there's a real role, I think, for communication centers and communication centers faculty in helping scientists do what they need to do better. And there is funding out there, certainly from NSF, if you're willing to think a little bit outside the comfort zone and the box that you're normally in. I think that there's some possibilities. I wanted at this point to open up the talk for conversation. Yeah, we have plenty of time left. I think sometimes the most useful parts of these talks are when you can ask questions. And I also wanted to take a second to tell you that I got most of my images from Unsplash, some from Wikimedia, and a couple of them from, one of them is from my book from John Wagger, and then a couple I pulled off the internet. Yes, please.
Most of the research, or a lot of research I've been able to read, is about communication education at the graduate level. So we've been trying to tackle this at the undergraduate level, where at least if a student who's majoring in science, when they leave, maybe they go into industry, they don't go on to a research. They at least have some communication idea before they. Do you have any thoughts about inserting communication education in graduate experiences?
So the question is from Arizona State, and they're interested in how you might have communication experience in an undergraduate experience for the sciences. And I think that the doorway there is in diversity and inclusion. NSF is very interested in promoting diversity and inclusion in the sciences. And if you can design some kind of a program that addresses the underserved minorities through communications, then I think there's a lot of things that could be done there. Now, exactly how that would play on your campus, how that would come in courses and those kinds of things. But you saw one of the grants that I put up there was to put together modules using communications theory to address diversity and inclusion. And there's some.
I mean, do you personally have thoughts of ways that you can see, forget about the grant, not forget about grants, but I mean, your experience about just inserting that communication education at an undergraduate level rather than waiting? It seems like the curriculum for undergrads is jam-packed and they don't have any space for any kind of communication.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you get that into the courses in an undergraduate level when it's such a jam-packed curriculum there? But so here at UNCG, of course, we had, I don't, because I'm essentially retired now, I haven't kept up with the latest news on this, but we had a speaking across the curriculum program, right? And every student had to complete certain courses that had a speaking component. And I've taught those courses for many years. If your campus has something like that, of course, there's a natural way in that you could try to develop modules that would fit in to what they're already doing. If they don't have that, it's starting to have conversations with faculty and department heads saying, we think that there's a value to having students doing their own presentations, especially when the cases where they have small classes. For instance, even at the undergraduate level, but at the level where they are not majors. So what we're doing for our non-majors now is they're writing lab reports. Well, that's probably completely useless to an undergraduate to graduate being able to write a lab report. But for an undergraduate to be able to speak coherently about some scientific subject to his peers is not unrelated to what they're going to do in the rest of their life. And so that might be a way, looking at that level also, not in the majors, but at the non-majors. And some of these non-major courses are huge. There are many more non-majors than majors in many science departments. So that's kind of off the top of my head what I can say. There are other questions, or there can be questions on YouTube also. If anyone has a question, we have someone monitoring there. Okay, nothing virtual now. Any questions from the people here? Comments?
I'm going to ask another one then.
Okay.
Okay, so sometimes if you are mentoring a student and they come in and they have their poster and it is just a train wreck poster and you can't figure out what it's saying. And then you try to give them, maybe a mentor in the lab tries to give them some feedback as to how to make the poster a little more relatable. and they say, yeah, this is what my professor said. So it's almost like it's generations of that communication.
Yes, so the question is about
So
giving
how can we
feedback.
help them break away from those generations of bad communication?
The comment is, that when you are presenting, sometimes your professor will say, I want you to do it this way. And when someone from outside looks at that poster or at that presentation, they just can't make anything out of it. But that's what the professor wants them to do. And so there's kind of generations of bad communication there. I think you just start where you can. You maybe aren't going to reach that student in that lab, but there's somebody in another lab that you can reach, and you just start working on it and work where you can. I don't know what else there's possibility of doing. People are going to see, as there start to be better posters and better talks, say that was a good talk. How did they do that talk? So I remember in the chemistry department here, they had we did a workshop for the chemistry department, and then they had kind of at Christmas time, the students get up and do some presentations, like a mini 3-minute thesis thing. And the faculty were really impressed with how well the students did. And I think the fact that we did some training with them had something to do with that. But so, that kind of can start steamrolling, right? So if the faculty walk away and say, well, that was better than I expected. It wasn't just a data dump. I mean, there are science faculty out there, they know that they do a 3-minute thesis, and the students' tendency is up there is just to dump all their data in 3 minutes and talk very fast about it. They know that that's not good. So, I think just chip away a little at the edges where you can find it, and then it'll eventually come. I think it's, it's like stand-up comics or musicians, right? They say, oh God, for 20 years, I played to a house of 3 people. And then something happened, it was miraculous, and now they're famous and they're on YouTube or they're doing a show at the Super Bowl, and you just got to keep at it until that happens. Got 2, we got 1 in the back, and then we'll do in the front.
If you could continue talking more about the agreement, how the apprentice science thesis into more story formatting, how to help them make that transition.
So the question was about the 3-minute thesis, and do I have anything to say about how to help students make a very complex 3-minute thesis into a simpler story format. So I hate to say read the book, but there is a nice section. There is a nice section in the book that's devoted to the 3-minute thesis, and there's more there than I can do today. And there's some really nice 3-minute thesis videos. The Asia Pacific regional competition, they put all of their videos online, and you can look at some of the winners, and some of the winners are extremely good. And so when I teach a 3-minute thesis class, I've got 2 of those or 2 or 3 of them that are really my favorites, and I show those, and I ask the students to analyze them with me. What did they do in the first minute? What did they do in the second minute? What did they do in the third minute? They see that they're really clear, and then they see that the first minute kind of gives the background, the second minute gives their procedures, and the third minute gives their results, what their conclusions were. And that gives them the idea that that's how they should organize their 3-minute thesis. And then, since these are such good presentations, we can talk about presentation style. We talk about what their presence is like on the stage. We can get students up at the front of the room, practicing a little bit right in front of it, getting a little bit of feedback. So in a couple hours, you can get students pretty far along on that. And you're not going to reach every student, but you do pretty good with a room full of students. Get them all doing a little better job. I hope that gives some quick ideas. Yeah, there's another question with that.
I have a question from online. So they're asking, how does the communication center start relationships with science faculty? So what's the best way for comm centers to do that?
So there's a question from online. How do communication center faculty start communication or start conversations with science faculty? So I think there's a couple of ways you can do that. It really depends on your institution. First, you can look at people in the sciences who are already doing outreach. And there are students or faculty who are interested in that. So we have a group of students who do a science cafe. And so their faculty members obviously supporting that, even though the faculty member isn't intimately involved with any of the organization, they're supporting it, and they're a person you can approach about having these kinds of conversations and getting some kind of communication center involvement in that. You can talk to your grants office. And I mean, and if you're going to do these NSF grants and broader impacts things, you've got to have conversations with the grants office. And I would always start at the top so that someone in lower on just can't say, no, we don't do that because they haven't done that before. And you go up there and you say, money, 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 money to the head of the grants office. And they say, well, maybe we should look into that. And so that's another way. And then they go to the science faculty and say, look, there may be some opportunities here to improve your chances of getting a grant. Maybe you should talk to these people. So I would say those are the two immediately off the top of my head ways of doing it.
My question is in regards to the grant writing process. I know that many research or communication centers, there's some people who the directors are doctors, others who are just, are faculty who just have a master's degree. And I know that for the grant writing process, a lot of times if you're looking for a grant, whoever is PI, it's usually, and that's I don't know if it's true or not, but they search for people who are doctors or that have some career path so that the approval or the granting, can go through it for the grant. And so my question is, let's say we do set up this science communication collaboration and I just have a master's, can I still be a PI in that along with the collaboration of the science faculty? And will it still, the likelihood of it still be okay, even if, we might have the greatest broader statement, but does that impact?
So the question is about whether you have to have a PhD or the equivalent in your discipline in order to be a PI on a grant, on an NSF grant. And I don't really know the technical answer to that. I would say the PIs on grants are the people who have the most intimate connection with the goals of the grant. And for many of these kinds of grants that we've looked at, that's probably not the communication center faculty as the main PI on that. They're probably co-PIs or some other thing besides the main PI. You saw like associate provosts and things, but some of those things across university levels or directors of centers and things, and that could be a communication center. So I don't think there's any absolute reason that a director of a communication center, certainly with a PhD, couldn't be a PI. I'm not sure that's going to be the most common way that this happens. I just don't know about a master's degree, how that would be looked at. It's just never come out.
It goes back to building those relationships with other faculty.
Yeah.
In this case, like science, as you're suggesting.
Yeah, it comes back to building other relationships with scientists and with other programs on your campus. And you can ask your grants office that question. They'll know the answer to that, whether you could be a PI or not.
I could interject here one interesting strategy. If it's fuzzy, if the grants office is not sure, there's always the co-PI, right? Where you have a team where one person does have a PhD and the other person has a degree, and that way you kind of hedge your bets, and you have the specific expertise of each person playing into that. It's also an opportunity, so you probably have time for one more.
Okay, so that was a comment from the audience saying that the co-PI road is probably also a good way to look into this. We have, welcome. Thank you for the question. One more question. Yes.
Do you have any advice on getting students in the sciences to see the value in improving their communication?
Do I have any advice about getting students in the sciences to see the value of improving their communication skills? I think, again, it's going to be individual. Some students see it right away, and some people, they see they'll come to workshops and they'll come and they'll want to do it, and others will just not see it, partly because their major professor will be saying, don't pay attention, don't spend your time on that. It's not that important. So some of it I'm saying you don't have control over because the major professor is going to overrule some of the things. And so you've got to find people, and in professors that are going to be willing to have their students do this kind of work and then work with those students and then show slowly that there's an effect. If you wanted to make arguments for them, you say you want to have a section of a web page, where you say these are the benefits that you would have if you work with us. You can say they're going to understand their research better, they're going to communicate with their colleagues better, they're going to have better prospects for a job, because when you go out to a general conference, you want your work research to be understood by people who are outside your field. Because when they are hiring, when a university is hiring, they've already got someone probably in, how to say it, they're looking for someone in a field where they don't have anyone yet. So that means you've got to talk to people who are not in your field. If they had someone in your field, they wouldn't be looking for you. And so it's going to improve your job prospects, and it's going to improve your ability to get grants, which is the bottom line for everything. You don't succeed in science these days without having an NSF grant. NSF wants you to have a clear statement of major impact of your grant. What are the big questions you're looking at? You're going to start by practicing on your thesis work with your titles, telling us what the big importance of this is. So when it comes to writing the grant, you'll be able to do this process and to work down then to what the major impacts are. So there's a lot of arguments you can use. It's not going to work on some students because they're not going to get to the point where they're listening. But the ones who are starting to listen, there are powerful reasons why they would want to be better communicators. Well, I think that completes our time. I wanted to thank you so much for your attention. And thank everyone who's listening online.